The Galactic Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds. Every species surrendered the same way. When resistance became pointless, they chose survival. But Earth did something that had never happened before. Humans knew they would lose. They ran the numbers. They counted the dead. They saw the future. And they still said, "We will not surrender." Not because they believed they could win, but because they decided there are things worse than death. Weeks later, the Empire made an unprecedented decision. They did not destroy Earth. They marked it with a designation reserved for black holes. Do not conquer. And now you are about to learn why humanity became the first species that force could not break. Classification matrices assembled across the upper tiers of the Concordat Strategic Intelligence Directorate with the quiet efficiency of a system that had never been wrong. Probability engines hummed through permutations refined across centuries of successful expansion, their conclusions as familiar as gravity. A newly contacted system appeared on the long list of pending integrations, briefly illuminated before being reduced to columns of risk, value, and expected compliance. Earth occupied a low position in every meaningful category. Technological maturity remained incomplete, energy manipulation unsophisticated, interstellar capability absent. Industrial output showed promise, but lacked scalability beyond its home gravity well. Political cohesion existed only recently and under visible strain. Cultural analysis suggested fragmentation, contradiction, and unresolved internal conflict. The consensus model predicted rapid capitulation following demonstration of force, followed by orderly absorption into vassal frameworks. Initial annotations reflected boredom more than interest. The system had processed dozens of comparable worlds, all of which had resolved according to expectation. A short period of resistance occasionally occurred, typically driven by ideological inertia or internal power struggles, but the outcome never varied. Survival asserted itself as the dominant variable. Submission followed. Historical precedent supported the conclusion. Species facing asymmetrical power gradients consistently selected continuity over extinction. Loss aversion dominated strategic behavior. Emotional factors produced noise, but not deviation. The mathematics were stable. The Earth entry passed through standard verification layers without challenge until the first contact reconstruction phase. Sensor data from the opening movements of the subjugation fleet aligned with predictive models. Force ratios exceeded thresholds associated with immediate surrender. Communication latency fell within acceptable norms. No irregular escalation patterns appeared in orbital space. All indicators suggested compliance. The anomaly surfaced quietly, without alarm or emphasis. Human decision trees, extrapolated from intercepted transmissions and internal coordination signals, failed to collapse toward surrender outcomes. Instead of narrowing, the probability spread widened. Resistance likelihood declined initially, then stabilized rather than diminishing further. Secondary models flagged cultural variables as insufficiently weighted. A minor analyst note recorded the inconsistency and attributed it to data noise. Human communication exhibited contradictory emotional registers, alternating between fear responses and commitment signals incompatible with rational survival calculus. Additional cultural ingestion was authorized, largely as a formality. As the siege simulation updated, projected losses for Earth climbed into catastrophic ranges without triggering surrender thresholds. The system attempted recalibration, increasing the weight of deterrence factors and civilian attrition. The result remained unchanged. Resistance persisted as a viable branch long after it should have collapsed. Supervisory review acknowledged the discrepancy, but categorized it as low priority. Similar irregularities had appeared before in species with ritualized honor systems or fatalistic belief structures. All had resolved under sustained pressure. The report advanced to the next stage with minimal commentary. Only a single internal marker remained appended to the file, not as a warning, but as a question. Human strategic behavior did not align with known surrender archetypes. The designation remained provisional, the tone unchanged, yet the system hesitated for the first time in recorded memory. The file continued forward regardless, unaware that this hesitation marked the beginning of a classification failure that would ripple far beyond a single world. Operational reconstruction proceeded with expected rigor. Every engagement, transmission, and material loss was cataloged and cross-indexed against historical surrender curves. The opening phase unfolded in a manner indistinguishable from hundreds of prior subjugations. Orbital dominance was established without contest. Defensive satellites were neutralized with precision sufficient to demonstrate control while avoiding unnecessary resource expenditure. Planetary command structures degraded rapidly under targeted strikes. Human fleet assets mobilized in full, despite projections that indicated immediate withdrawal or symbolic engagement. Analysts recorded the maneuver as posturing rather than intent. Engagement logs confirmed technological inferiority consistent with initial assessments. Human vessels suffered disproportionate losses upon contact. Structural integrity failures occurred within seconds of exposure to directed energy weapons. Attrition rates exceeded survivability margins by orders of magnitude. Civilian infrastructure collapse followed predictable patterns. Power distribution failures cascaded across population centers. Supply chain disruptions produced secondary mortality unrelated to direct military action. Atmospheric and biosphere damage remained within acceptable limits. Compliance thresholds were recalculated to account for rising civilian cost. The models predicted surrender within a narrowing temporal window. The window passed. Updated projections displayed a stabilization of resistance probability. Despite catastrophic losses, human command coherence improved. Intercepted communications revealed increasing synchronization across formerly fragmented political entities. Emergency governance structures consolidated authority without internal conflict. The expected degradation into panic or factionalism failed to materialize. Analysts adjusted variables. Psychological resilience coefficients were increased. Ideological rigidity was introduced as a potential modifier. Cultural ingestion accelerated, drawing from historical archives, media output, and mythological narratives. The working hypothesis framed human persistence as denial, driven by insufficient comprehension of the threat magnitude. That assumption failed when subsequent transmissions demonstrated clear awareness of projected extinction scenarios. Human command continued issuing orders optimized not for survival, but for engagement frequency. Tactical patterns emerged emphasizing harassment, forced maneuvering, and sacrificial contact. These actions produced negligible strategic gain, yet imposed measurable operational cost on Concordat forces. Fuel expenditure increased. Formation integrity required constant adjustment. Fleet tempo slowed. The report flagged this behavior as inefficient. Secondary analysts proposed the presence of internal command malfunction or ideological extremism overriding rational governance. However, damage assessments showed no degradation in decision quality or logistical planning. Human operations displayed consistency, discipline, and long-term coordination incompatible with chaos. Casualty tolerance metrics exceeded known species maximums. Civilian mortality failed to correlate with surrender signals. Instead, resistance broadcasts intensified in both frequency and emotional cohesion. The population response did not fragment. Compliance sentiment did not rise. For the first time, a comparative analysis returned null results. No historical precedent aligned with observed behavior. Species previously identified as fanatic or honor-bound had collapsed under similar pressures. Humans did not. Internal commentary increased in density. Analysts annotated projections with conditional language previously absent from Concordat reporting standards. Terms such as persistence anomaly and resistance saturation appeared, flagged for supervisory review. The reconstruction concluded its phase assessment with an unresolved status. Siege progression remained tactically successful, yet strategically stagnant. Human behavior demonstrated intention without expectation of victory, a condition the models could not quantify. The report advanced with a note appended in rare, non-automated language. Resistance behavior appears structured rather than reflexive. Objective may not be survival. The notation lingered, unchallenged, as the system moved forward into deeper analysis. Analytical confidence eroded in increments too small to trigger alarms, yet too persistent to ignore. Predictive engines recalibrated themselves repeatedly, cycling through expanded variable sets and revised weighting schemas, each iteration producing projections that contradicted the last. The system responded as designed, assuming incomplete data or improper emphasis, never questioning the architecture itself. Yet every correction widened divergence rather than narrowing it. Human operational behavior settled into patterns that resisted conventional classification. Engagement frequency increased as asset availability declined. Strike packages launched from damaged platforms with minimal recovery probability. Command nodes persisted despite repeated decapitation attempts, reconstituting authority structures faster than attrition models allowed. The resistance did not fray. It condensed. Cost analysis units flagged anomalies in concordat expenditure curves. Fuel consumption rose beyond campaign norms. Maintenance cycles shortened. Crew fatigue indicators trended upward across multiple fleet elements. None of these variables alone constituted strategic risk, yet their aggregation produced an unfamiliar contour. A subjugation operation designed for efficiency was bleeding resources at a rate disproportionate to target value. Reassessment teams introduced a new analytical frame. Instead of measuring human action against surrender likelihood, they examined it through cost imposition metrics. The results unsettled the review boards. Human losses correlated directly with concordat operational drag. Each destroyed human vessel generated maneuver disruption. Each failed assault forced defensive reconfiguration. Each escalation required the concordat to act more cautiously, not less. This behavior contradicted all recorded deterrence theory. Species facing extinction scenarios historically reduced engagement to preserve bargaining potential. Humans did the opposite. The closer they moved toward annihilation, the more aggressively they acted to increase the price of conquest. Cultural analysts re-entered the data stream with expanded authority. Historical ingestion shifted from military archives to socio-cultural records. The focus moved away from victories and toward defeats. The result was a pattern without equivalent in known species behavior. Human mythology and historical memory elevated endurance, sacrifice, and defiance over success. Loss did not diminish narrative value. In many cases, it enhanced it. Resistance was not framed internally as a means to an end. It was framed as the end itself. This realization forced an uncomfortable reassessment of the rational actor assumption embedded within concordat doctrine. Imperial expansion relied on the premise that survival outweighed all abstract values. Submission followed demonstration of inevitability because inevitability negated hope. Humans appeared immune to this mechanism. Hope was not required. Strategic projections incorporated a new hypothetical. Human leadership did not expect victory and had accounted for that outcome before the campaign began. This assumption aligned with observed behavior. Resource allocation prioritized immediate disruption rather than preservation. Command decisions accepted catastrophic loss thresholds without deviation. Psychological stress indicators among the population rose, yet compliance signals remained absent. Senior analysts convened emergency synthesis reviews. The tone of internal documentation shifted. Neutral language gave way to cautious qualifiers. Foundational axioms were referenced explicitly for the first time in centuries, not as truths, but as assumptions. The question emerged without authorization and spread regardless. What if survival was not the primary driver? Simulation clusters attempted to model a species whose utility function placed abstract constructs above biological continuity. The engines failed. Without survival as an anchor, optimization dissolved into noise. The system could not calculate the actions of an entity willing to accept extinction as an acceptable outcome. Operational intelligence flagged another pattern. Human attacks increasingly targeted symbolic concordat assets rather than tactically optimal ones. Supply convoys, communications relays, and command vessels became priority targets regardless of defensive strength. These strikes yielded minimal immediate advantage, but generated outsized psychological impact across vassal state observation networks. The resistance was being broadcast. Information warfare specialists confirmed widespread data leakage despite suppression protocols. Human transmissions circulated through neutral and vassal channels, often embedded within cultural media rather than direct military reporting. The content emphasized persistence over success. Losses were presented without mitigation or apology. The narrative was consistent and disturbingly effective. Observer species began adjusting internal threat assessments. Passive surveillance recorded shifts in obedience metrics within multiple vassal systems. Minor compliance delays appeared. Tribute schedules slipped. Confidence in concordat inevitability declined by fractional, yet measurable margins. The implication was catastrophic. Imperial stability depended on the perception that resistance was futile. Humanity was eroding that perception without defeating a single fleet. Their example reframed conquest as costly rather than hopeless. Once that reframing took hold, the Empire faced a problem no amount of firepower could erase. Oversight intervention arrived in the form of a directive inquiry. Senior doctrine authorities demanded an explanation for the analytical failures. Why had surrender not occurred? Why did projections remain unstable? Why did a pre-interstellar species command such disproportionate attention? The response compiled itself with unusual hesitation. Drafts were discarded. Language was revised repeatedly to remove speculative phrasing while preserving accuracy. The final submission acknowledged what had previously been unthinkable. Humanity did not interpret the campaign as a contest to be won. It interpreted it as a statement to be made. Their strategy treated loss as a communicative act. Each destroyed city, each annihilated fleet element, each civilian death reinforced a singular message. Conquest would not be clean. Rule would not be stable. Victory would not be cheap. This realization reframed the entire campaign. The siege was not failing because of insufficient force. It was failing because force was the wrong instrument. Overwhelming power lost meaning against an opponent who defined success independently of outcome. The classification framework strained under the weight of this contradiction. Humanity fit no existing category. They were neither irrational nor defective. Their logic was consistent, internally coherent, and catastrophically incompatible with imperial doctrine. As the report advanced to higher clearance levels, its tone abandoned detachment entirely. Concern replaced curiosity. Analysts began to write as participants rather than observers. The file expanded beyond its original scope, no longer describing a single system, but questioning the foundations of conquest itself. The chapter concluded with an unprecedented recommendation for continued observation without escalation. Not as mercy, not as caution, as necessity. The system recorded this recommendation without yet understanding that it marked the moment the Empire stopped studying humanity as a target and began studying it as a threat. Historical correlation protocols activated as analytical confidence collapsed. When predictive systems failed to converge, concordat doctrine required comparison. Analysts searched imperial archives for behavioral parallels among previously encountered species, isolating instances where resistance exceeded rational expectation. The effort yielded no meaningful matches. Species classified as honor-bound eventually exhausted themselves. Ideological absolutists fractured under sustained loss. Fanatical civilizations burned brightly and briefly before collapsing inward. None displayed the pattern now emerging from Earth. Attention shifted from military records to cultural substrates. Human data ingestion expanded beyond governance and warfare into mythology, literature, and collective memory. The resulting profile unsettled, even hardened analysts. Humanity's defining narratives were not built around triumph, but around endurance. Defeat did not function as deterrent or lesson. It functioned as proof. Repeatedly, human history elevated moments of annihilation into foundational symbols. Cities destroyed became rallying icons. Armies erased from existence were remembered not as failures, but as moral victories. Sacrifice acquired meaning independent of outcome. Losses validated the cause rather than undermined it. This inversion violated every known deterrence principle. Concordat enforcement relied on punishment as instruction. Pain demonstrated futility. Survival followed submission. Humans appeared to process pain as confirmation of legitimacy. Escalation did not weaken resolve. It hardened it. The report traced this phenomenon across centuries of internal conflict. Human societies repeatedly chose resistance despite catastrophic odds, not from ignorance, but from deliberation. Leadership figures who presided over annihilation were often revered rather than condemned. Martyrdom occupied a central place in cultural memory, stripped of despair and reframed as purpose. Analysts struggled to quantify this behavior. Traditional morale degradation curves inverted when applied to human populations. Casualty accumulation correlated with increased cohesion rather than fragmentation. Civilian suffering did not destabilize governance structures, but reinforced them. The social contract tightened under pressure. Fear entered the language of the report for the first time. Not fear of human victory, but fear of uncontrollability. Humanity could not be managed through cost imposition because cost validated resistance. They could not be pacified through survival incentives because survival was not the highest priority. They could not be broken without annihilation, and annihilation produced martyrs rather than compliance. The deterrence paradox crystallized. Any force sufficient to end resistance would destroy the very value of conquest. Any force insufficient to annihilate would strengthen opposition. The campaign occupied a lethal middle ground where every action favored the defender. Analysts examined human communication outputs during peak devastation periods. Broadcasts did not emphasize suffering or appeal for relief. They documented loss with deliberate clarity. Names were recorded. Ruins were shown without embellishment. The narrative framing was consistent. Endurance itself was the message. The act of continuing was portrayed as success. Comparative semiotic analysis revealed a deeper pattern. Humanity framed resistance as identity. To stop resisting was not a strategic decision, but a transformation of self. Submission equated to erasure more complete than death. In this framework, extinction preserved meaning where obedience erased it. Imperial observers monitoring vassal state response reported secondary effects. Human narratives circulated despite suppression. The concept of resistance without victory entered the cultural vocabulary of subject worlds. Minor acts of defiance increased. Compliance rituals lost emotional weight. The illusion of inevitability began to fracture. This contagion effect alarmed strategic command. Humanity's true weapon was not its fleets, but its example. A single world demonstrated that empire could be opposed without hope of success, and that demonstration destabilized centuries of imperial psychology. The report abandoned pretense of neutrality. Analysts wrote with urgency, aware that doctrine itself was under threat. Humanity represented a structural vulnerability. An empire predicated on rational surrender could not tolerate a species that rejected the premise entirely. The chapter concluded with a stark assessment. Humanity transformed suffering into legitimacy. Every escalation affirmed their worldview. Continued pressure would not end resistance. It would sanctify it. For the first time in Concordat history, the report acknowledged an adversary whose defeat would constitute a strategic loss regardless of outcome. The system advanced toward final classification with the recognition that conquest had already failed in principle, even if fleets still held orbit. System-wide impact assessments replaced campaign metrics as the report crossed its final internal thresholds. The Sol system ceased to be evaluated as an isolated engagement and was reclassified as a destabilizing node within the broader imperial framework. Analysts no longer asked whether Earth could be subdued. They asked what continued interaction would do to the Concordat itself. Indicators of vassal compliance degradation appeared first at the margins. Tribute schedules experienced minor delays justified by logistical variance. Military auxiliary quotas were met with procedural friction. Communication latency increased in systems previously known for prompt obedience. None of these deviations constituted rebellion, yet together they formed a pattern that intelligence doctrine identified as pre-insurrectional drift. Correlation analysis traced the origin of these shifts to unauthorized data circulation. Human resistance narratives propagated through cultural channels rather than military ones, embedded in entertainment streams, artistic archives, and personal correspondence. The content did not instruct rebellion. It documented defiance. That documentation proved sufficient. Observers reported an emerging cognitive shift among subject populations. The inevitability of conquest, once accepted as immutable law, was now questioned. Humanity had not defeated the Concordat. Yet the Empire had failed to defeat humanity quickly. That delay alone undermined centuries of psychological conditioning. Resistance no longer appeared futile. It appeared costly but possible. Strategic planners attempted to counter the effect through intensified demonstrations of power elsewhere. Subjugation campaigns were accelerated in peripheral systems. Force ratios increased. Casualty tolerance thresholds were lowered to expedite surrender. The results were mixed. Compliance occurred, but with visible resentment and diminished legitimacy. Each new conquest required greater expenditure than the last. The report introduced a new classification category to describe humanity's influence: mimetic destabilizer. Unlike conventional threats, humanity altered the decision calculus of other species without direct contact. Their value systems spread faster than fleets could respond. Internal debate intensified. Some doctrine authorities advocated annihilation. Total eradication would remove the source of contagion and restore the narrative of inevitability. Counterarguments identified the flaw immediately. Annihilation would confirm the human thesis. It would demonstrate that the Empire required extermination to enforce obedience. Martyrdom would echo across every world. Resistance would not end. It would metastasize. Others proposed prolonged occupation and re-education. Cultural suppression models were simulated. They failed consistently. Human resistance behavior intensified under restriction. Compliance remained performative rather than internalized. The population accepted death, deprivation, and loss of future generations rather than ideological assimilation. Containment strategies followed. Quarantine of information channels. Isolation of the Sol system. Suppression of reference material. These measures slowed propagation but could not reverse it. The idea had already escaped. Humanity had introduced a dangerous precedent into the imperial psyche. The report's tone shifted from urgency to alarm. Analysts documented a cascading risk scenario. Continued engagement with Earth would necessitate either unprecedented brutality or indefinite resource drain. Either outcome weakened imperial coherence. Victory, defined traditionally, became indistinguishable from defeat. Senior command intervention was noted in the margins of the document. Language softened publicly while internal assessments hardened. The term unconquerable appeared in preliminary drafts before being removed and reinserted with heavier qualification. Humanity resisted classification because it invalidated existing doctrine. Yet no alternative term survived peer review. Earth was reframed as a strategic liability. Its material value was negligible compared to the cost of precedent it imposed. Every day the siege continued broadcast a single message across Concordat space. The Empire could be resisted. That message could not be recalled. The recommendation section expanded beyond protocol length. Analysts argued not from ideology, but from arithmetic. Resource curves, morale indices, and compliance projections all converged on the same conclusion. Engagement produced negative return regardless of outcome. Withdrawal preserved imperial structure at the cost of prestige. Continuation risked systemic fracture. The report acknowledged this as a loss condition, though the term defeat remained absent. The Concordat could win the battle and lose the Empire. Humanity had redefined the strategic environment by refusing to participate in its assumptions. The chapter closed with a formal advisory elevated to the highest clearance tier. Earth was no longer to be considered a conquest target. It was to be treated as a catalytic threat whose influence exceeded its physical capacity. Avoidance emerged as the only rational strategy against an irrational opponent who had made irrationality consistent. Final adjudication convened within the deepest strata of Concordat strategic cognition, where doctrines older than recorded expansion were preserved and rarely questioned. The Sol system dossier arrived there not as a campaign report, but as an anomaly requiring philosophical arbitration. Its mass exceeded standard limits, its annotation density rivaled foundational charters, and its conclusions resisted compression. This was no longer an evaluation of failure or success. It was an examination of whether the principles that had governed empire for centuries remained valid. Humanity was extracted from conventional adversarial taxonomies at the outset of review. Analysts determined that continued comparison against known enemy archetypes produced distortion rather than clarity. Earth was not misclassified because of insufficient data. It was misclassified because the underlying framework assumed convergence toward survival as an absolute. Humanity did not converge. Their behavior demonstrated coherence without that anchor, a condition previously considered theoretical and operationally irrelevant. The report documented this divergence in exhaustive detail. Human decision-making remained internally consistent across escalating loss thresholds. Command continuity persisted despite decapitation attempts. Civilian morale did not collapse under deprivation, but reorganized around endurance narratives. Strategic choices prioritized immediate disruption of imperial operations over long-term preservation of assets. These were not acts of desperation. They were expressions of a value system that did not recognize survival as supreme. Imperial doctrine defined rationality through optimization of continuity. Humanity optimized for meaning. This distinction invalidated deterrence, punishment, and demonstration as tools of compliance. Force confirmed resistance rather than resolving it. Loss authenticated defiance. Escalation strengthened resolve. Withdrawal justification required unprecedented care. Linguistic committees labored to excise terms associated with defeat while preserving operational truth. Strategic reprioritization replaced retreat. Resource reallocation replaced loss. Stability preservation replaced failure. Beneath the euphemism architecture lay a conclusion immune to wording. Engagement with Earth produced negative return across material, psychological, and ideological domains. Psychological assessments appended to the report revealed internal destabilization within Concordat command structures. Officers trained across generations to expect capitulation encountered an opponent whose resistance could not be disciplined. The absence of surrender generated cognitive strain rather than fear. Victory had always been synonymous with inevitability. Humanity dissolved inevitability without seizing advantage. Orbits were held. Fleets remained operational. Yet certainty evaporated. Escalation pathways received final review with full transparency. Planetary annihilation remained technically achievable. The report rejected it unanimously. Extermination would transform humanity into an empire-wide symbol of legitimacy through sacrifice. Martyrdom would propagate faster than suppression fleets could respond. Terror would replace authority. Historical projections marked that transition as terminal for imperial cohesion. Occupation models proved equally untenable. Human populations demonstrated ideological resilience incompatible with assimilation. Governance required permanent coercion. Coercion intensified resistance. Resistance sanctified suffering. The cycle possessed no equilibrium favorable to the Concordat. Compliance remained performative at best, identity eroding only through total eradication. Eradication negated the value of conquest. Containment emerged as the sole viable strategy. The Sol system would be isolated within navigational and logistical databases. Transit advisories would discourage proximity. Engagement protocols would default to avoidance. Information referencing Earth would be restricted but not erased, acknowledging that suppression amplified interest. Humanity would not be provoked, tested, or challenged again. Curiosity offered no strategic yield. Designation language provoked extensive debate. Existing threat categories failed to capture a species lacking technological parity, yet exerting disproportionate influence through example alone. Humanity altered decision calculus across subject populations without command, coordination, or intent. Their resistance functioned as a mimetic vector, reframing conquest from inevitability to expense. The final classification entered archival record with unprecedented qualifiers. Humanity was designated unconquerable by conventional means, not through strength, numbers, or innovation, but through refusal. They did not acknowledge the authority of conquerors to define surrender. They rejected the premise that survival outweighed dignity. Against such a framework, force lost explanatory power. Doctrinal amendments followed immediately. Expansion planning incorporated ideological compatibility alongside material assessment. Species exhibiting resistance-oriented cultural values were to be bypassed regardless of technological inferiority. Cost projections alone justified avoidance. The Sol campaign redefined the boundary of imperial reach, not through defeat, but through invalidation. Collateral consequences were addressed without mitigation. Vassal compliance erosion was projected to continue. Resistance movements would arise not from hope of victory, but from rejection of inevitability. The Concordat would persist, but altered. Authority recalibrated from absolute to conditional. Expansion slowed as caution displaced certainty. Public records concealed these conclusions behind procedural language. Internally, the implication was explicit. The empire had encountered a civilization it could not break without breaking itself. That recognition reshaped strategic planning across all theaters. Confidence receded. Restraint replaced dominance as the guiding principle. The report synthesized its findings without detachment. Humanity represented a divergent answer to the same existential equation faced by all sentient life. When confronted with annihilation or submission, most species chose survival. Humans chose authorship. They defined survival on their own terms and accepted extinction as an acceptable price for autonomy. This choice weaponized loss. Suffering became legitimacy. Endurance replaced victory as the metric of success. Conquest ceased to function when resistance refused termination. Humanity did not seek to win. They sought to ensure domination was never efficient, never clean, never stable. Final annotations addressed the philosophical fracture exposed by the campaign. Imperial doctrine assumed fear of death governed decision-making. Humanity demonstrated a population willing to subordinate life to identity. Systems built on deterrence failed against actors who treated deterrence as validation. Navigational charts updated quietly across Concordat space. The Sol system received a marker reserved for anomalies whose engagement risk exceeded calculable gain. Resources unjustified. Influence disproportionate to value. Avoidance mandated. Humanity rebuilt within isolation, unaware of the depth of judgment rendered against them. Cities lay in ruin. Fleets were shattered. Losses were permanent. None of these variables altered the conclusion. The Empire had measured the wrong parameters because it misunderstood the question. They had not demonstrated superior force. They had demonstrated refusal without termination. The report closed without projection. No model attempted to forecast what humanity might become once technological parity arrived. The Concordat elected ignorance as strategy, diversion as survival. Expansion corridors bent away from a small, damaged world whose gravity derived not from mass or power, but from precedent. Classification sealed.